Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all coping as good as possible in these challenging times. My name is Peter Dolbit, and I'm the Deputy Director General of the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's session and to today's webinar with the topic of doing business in post-COVID New India. I'm very happy to be introducing a session which deals with the time after COVID. That is quite uplifting, but we also all know that we will manage this crisis sooner or later. Recent economic news on India is not that great. I mean, S&P just yesterday, I think, says gross domestic product for the current fiscal year maybe 9.8%, down from its March estimate of 11%, and that also if infections peak this month. And one more month of rising cases may slow down the expansion to 8.2%, following an 8% drop of input in the last financial year. But I'm convinced that India will sail through the current situation, and that's basically on sound macroeconomic management and strong macro fundamentals. I would like now to welcome our partner of today, Standard Chartered Bank. Also, a special welcome to Jayant Singh, who is Assistant Vice President of Invest India and who is for the National Investment Promotion and Facilitation Agency of the Government of India. In his current role, he's responsible for increasing foreign direct investment in the aerospace, defense, and civil aviation sectors. He also heads the investor targeting and facilitation for Russia, CIS, and for Germany and Eastern Germany. He speaks German also. He lived 3 years or 4 years in Berlin, so Germany is very close to his heart also. Jayant leads the executing team for the Indo-German fast track mechanism. Welcome, Jayant. Today, you will talk to us on emerging opportunities in post-COVID New India. Members of the Standard Chartered team include Suresh Mitra, who is leading the business commercial banking for Standard in India. Suresh will be talking about capitalizing Indian subsidiaries. And last but not least, I welcome Sneha Srivastava. She's Director of Financial Markets. Sneha has more than 17 years of relevant banking experience. She will cover the third session and talk to us about Forex risk management, key regulations and instruments. As always, after the 3 sessions, you will be in a position to ask questions. Let me thank you now for all of you for registering to this webinar. I hope we will have insightful sessions. Jayant, will you please start? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Just give me a second while I share my presentation. Can you see my screen? Is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone is safe. The theme for today's session is doing business in post-COVID New India. So keeping that in mind, my presentation will focus on a few things. Firstly, what is New India? What characterizes the transformation that India is experiencing right now? Second, what are some of the interventions that the government of India has undertaken to make it easier to do business in India? Thirdly, going forward, what are some of the opportunities that foreign investors should be looking at in the Indian market? And I'm going to round off the presentation today by talking a little bit about the experience of German companies in India and also some of the bilateral initiatives that have been that are there for German investors in the country. I always like to start out with this slide, with this set of images, because I think it helps us define the new transforming India that we're talking about. If a foreign investor was to have landed in Mumbai, which is our financial capital, in 2013, then the image on your top left is the site that he would have been greeted with. But if you fast track 5 years down the line, Mumbai now has a plush modern airport that can handle more than 900 aircraft movements in a day. That has an annual passenger capacity of more than 60 million people, making it one of the largest airports in the world. Similarly, the Meerut Highway links key industrial zones in northern India and is now a 10-lane access controlled highway. And there are many such infrastructure development stories that you can find across India. And they just show the transformation that the country has been witnessing and will continue to witness over the next few years. And for us, this transforming India message is very important because these few numbers in essence capture the very metamorphosis that India is going through right now. Sorry, I think I just lost my presentation. Just 1 second. How can I see my presentation again? I'm really sorry about this.
Jayant, we are on the slide where it's written transforming India, the GDP
no,
population.
I can only see my video. I'm not being able to see the presentation.
Okay, sure. Just 1 second. Jayant, can you see the presentation now?
Yeah, can you just go back? Yeah, sorry, as I was saying, for us, the transforming India message is very important because these two numbers in essence capture the very metamorphosis that India is going through right now. And these three stacks are very important for the future growth of the Indian economy as well. According to World Bank and IMF figures, India is the fastest growing, was and is one of the fastest growing large economies in the world today. But actually what's happening is that, there are probably 9 or 10 states within India that are firing this high growth rate. And what we're going to see over the next 24 months or so is that the next 5 or 6 states will be ready to fire and they'll be supplementing the growth story. So in terms of growth trajectory, India has just completed that proverbial U-bend of the hockey stick. By 2025, India will be 1.5 billion people. With an average age of 29 years. This will be the largest concentration of human capital on earth. So not only are we talking about a large market, but we're also talking about a huge potential resource. Our general elections in 2019 saw 900 million registered voters, of which 600 million cast their electoral franchise. And of that, 133 million were new voters. But I think the most crucial takeaway from these numbers is that never before in human history has such a large section of humanity undergone such rapid upward social mobility, and that also in such a short period of time. If you look at it, an Indian that was born in the say 1970s or 80s was expected to earn anywhere between 10 to 15,000 US dollars during his or her lifetime. But an Indian that is born in 2010, that's already 10 years ago, is expected to earn 245,000 US dollars during his or her lifetime. Now, if you multiply that by 1.5 billion people, that is the new India of today. Next slide, please. Now, there is recognition within the government that at the center of good politics is good economics. Because the fact remains that every year there are 10 million Indians that are joining the workforce, which means that the government has to find employment for a workforce twice the size of the city of Singapore every year. And the Make in India campaign remains absolutely crucial to that. The initiative aims to raise the contribution of the manufacturing sector to 25% of our GDP by the year 2025. In front of you are the 24 focus sectors of the Make in India campaign, and together they represent a market opportunity of $5 trillion. You can pick any of these sectors and you'll see that there is a lot of opportunity here for foreign investors to tap into. Aviation, for example, with more and more people able to afford air travel, the sector witnessed 52 consecutive months of double-digit growth. According to Boeing Airbus forecasts, the civil aviation fleet of Indian airlines is expected to quadruple in the next 15 years, which means that there's a requirement of 1,700 aircraft. So there's not only an opportunity on the services side, but there's also a big opportunity on the manufacturing side. Next slide, please. Again, as I was saying, aviation is not a standalone example. There are a lot of other such examples. We are the second largest smartphone market in the world. We are the fastest growing e-commerce market globally. Consumer durables growth has been 3 times the global average. And I think that's why the Make in India campaign has resonated so strongly with foreign investors, because no matter what sector you look at, no matter what segment you look at, there is an opportunity here for sustainable growth for enterprise in India. Next slide, please. The ease of doing business campaign remains absolutely crucial to making India a global manufacturing hub and has been a focus area for the government of India. Over the last 6 years or so, we have seen that there have been more than 10,000 procedural revisions that have taken place both at the center as well as the state level. Broadly speaking, I think the interventions focus on 3 main areas. One is improving the operating environment for businesses in India. Second is to reduce the risks that businesses in India face. And thirdly is to improve the business case to invest and or expand in the Indian market. So for example, the corporate tax rate was slashed to 17% for new businesses, making us the most competitive against competing jurisdictions. Foreign direct investment in several sectors has been liberalized. We are seeing that inverted duty structures are being rationalized and industrial infrastructure is constantly being upgraded. For example, more than 3,000 industrial parks have been notified or identified in India, where plug-and-play facilities are being developed so that foreign investors may come in and immediately start their manufacturing operations. We're already seeing the impact that this is having. According to the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business rankings, India has jumped 79 places and is at 63 currently since the Make in India campaign was introduced. The jump the year before last was the single largest jump by any country ever. Next slide, please. And we're already seeing this translating into a rate of growth that is rapidly accelerating. It took us 63 years to become an economy the size of $1 trillion, 7 years to reach $2 trillion, and then just 3 years to reach $3 trillion. And with foreign direct investment increasing, we are well on track to become a $5 trillion sized economy by the year 2025. We are also seeing that foreign investors are placing long-term bets on the Indian economy and that foreign direct investment is also accelerating. It took us 14 years to reach $300 billion of foreign direct investment, 4 years for $500 billion of FDI, and then in just 2 years, we've had record foreign direct investment of $681 billion. Next slide, please. As you can see, India remains one of the few bright spots in the global investment landscape. While global FDI numbers fell 42% in the year between 2019-2020, in India, actually FDI rose by 13% during the same period. Next slide, please. Infrastructure development will continue to underpin economic growth in the country, and it has been a focus area for the government across several budgets and will continue to be. Under the National Infrastructure Pipeline, a roadmap of infrastructure projects has been created and which will be developed between 2019 and 2025. The National Infrastructure Pipeline will see $1.4 trillion of investment across several sectors ranging from energy to roads, railways, irrigation, industrial investments. And I think here there is a lot of scope for private sector participation. Because of that $1.4 trillion in investment, it's envisioned that 20% of that investment will actually come from the private sector. Next slide, please. I think this is also a very important and a very interesting slide, because earlier Peter was talking about disruptions that the economy faces on account of COVID. This slide actually shows the resilience of our economy and our ability to rapidly mobilize manufacturing resources, even when black swan events like COVID happen and we are experienced in the economy. In just 60 days, we went from being a marginal producer of PPE kits to the second largest producer or manufacturer of PPE kits. We are now exporting PPE kits to several countries. Similarly, the economy is able to bounce back very quickly from the disruptive effects of these COVID lockdowns, these short-term aberrations, if you will. Pre-COVID levels of 100% pre-COVID levels of digital payments were reached as early as September 2020. Similarly, we reached 90% of e-commerce orders as early as pre-COVID e-commerce orders as early as June 2020. And it just shows that economic revival, even in the face of these black swan events and these short-term COVID lockdowns, is very swift and very apparent. Next slide, please. One trend that we were seeing, and this trend has actually been amplified since the onset of COVID-19, has been the de-risking of supply chains. And keeping that in mind, the government of India introduced the production linked incentive scheme, which was able to integrate India further into global value chains, and B, to also make India very competitive globally as a manufacturing destination. The production linked incentive scheme will see $27 billion of incentives outlay in the next 5 years, and it will be through 4 to 6% of incentives on incremental sales. It was first introduced for the pharmaceutical APIs, then for medical devices, mobile phones, and electronic components. It was a huge success, and there was overwhelming levels of applications, both from domestic manufacturers, but also from global investors such as Foxconn, Pegatron, Apple, etc. And the production-linked incentive scheme has also now been expanded to 10 other sectors, which you can see in front of you on your screen. Just 2 points I'll quickly make over here. One is that as a result of the production linked incentive scheme, we're going to see increasing levels of domestic value addition for products and components. So it's envisioned that for mobile phones, domestic value add will go from 15 to 20% to 35 to 40%. And for electronic components, it will go from 15% to 40 to 45%. Also, production-linked incentive scheme will generate $150 billion of manufacturing output in the next 5 years. And of that $150 billion, 60% will cater completely for exports. Next slide, please. In recent years, India has also been able to rapidly expand its R&D footprint and has gone on to become a global R&D hub for Fortune 500 companies. Companies like Bosch, Intel, Samsung, very recognizable brands have their largest R&D units outside of their domestic market in India. We right now have over 1,100 R&D centers in the country. Next slide, please. Another interesting thing we're seeing is that, this R&D and technical know-how has been married with entrepreneurial spirit by our youth. And as a result, we have a very thriving startup ecosystem with more than 50,000 startups, $90 billion in valuation, and more than 18 homegrown unicorns. India is the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. One of the strengths of India's startups is that the time that they take to become or reach a billion-dollar valuation or reach a unicorn status is much quicker than their global peers. And I think Ola is a classic example of that as compared to Uber. Next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly now talk about a little bit about German companies in India and some of the bilateral initiatives that have been introduced by the government of India for German investors. Next slide, please. I think it would not be an overstatement for me to say that German companies have played a very important role in shaping the landscape of Indian industry. Just in the last, I mean, there are companies, German companies that have been in India pre-independence even, but just in the last 20 years, there have been $12 billion of foreign investment that have come into India from Germany alone. Germany is the 7th largest foreign investor in the country. There are more than 600 Indo-German JVs that are there. And if you look at the sort of requests that Invest India as the National Investment Promotion Agency within Ministry of Commerce looks at, you'll see that it's not restricted to one sector alone or just a few sectors. The interest from the German industry is on Indian economy as a whole and is not restricted to one or two sectors. Companies such as Siemens, Bosch, Daimler are champions of Make in India, and they're not only making in India for India, but they're also making for the world. I mean, Daimler is a good example. Its plant in Tamil Nadu ships or exports to 50 different markets globally, from Latin America to Africa. Next slide, please. This is also a very interesting slide, and it shows the strengths of varied strengths of Indian manufacturing. Because if you look at it from a return on investment perspective, Indian subsidiaries regularly outperform their global parents. On the left, you'll see the example of Siemens, but if you were to move just away from Siemens, I can give you other examples as well. My favorite being Suzuki. Not only does Maruti Suzuki, the Indian subsidiary of Suzuki, have a larger market capitalization and greater revenues than its parent, but Maruti Suzuki sells more cars in India alone than Suzuki sells all over the world. That just shows you the type of manufacturing capabilities that India has and how well Indian subsidiaries do. Next slide, please. Again, as I was seeing, the bilateral partnership between India and Germany is very strong. And the government has done a lot as part of its larger ease of doing business mandate to support German investors in the country. One of those initiatives is the Indo-German fast track mechanism. As I was mentioning, there are a lot of German companies in India that have been here for a very long time, that have very expanded operations. And as part of that, there are sometimes issues that they face that crop up in their investments as well as their operations. And the Indo-German fast track mechanism is there to pick up on these issues and obstacles and to fast track the resolution of these issues. The Indo-German fast track mechanism was instituted in 2015 and was launched by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It was so successful and has been so successful in the last 5 to 6 years that other EU countries have also requested for a similar fast track mechanism, so that their companies can also get the level of support that German companies have been getting in India. Then there is also the Make in India Mittelstand program. As we're all aware that there are many German companies that are Mittelstand companies, medium-sized companies. Again, in the Indian context, they are billion-dollar companies, so they're very large, but they are companies that may not have a presence in the Asia-Pacific region, may not know as much about the Indian market and economy. So we work very closely with our mission in Berlin as well as the consulates to support these companies, in terms of bridging the information in asymmetry, but also in terms of supporting them in their investments over here as and when they require it. And lastly, there is a very strong level of participation and cooperation between Indian startups and German startups, and it's something that the German-India Startup Exchange Program supports very closely. Next slide. This is just quickly, Invest India is the national, as Peter was saying, the National Investment Promotion Agency. You can actually now start the poll questions. I'll just quickly give everyone attending today a little bit of an idea about how we can support these German companies in India. Thank you. So as I was saying, these are, firstly, I just want to say these are a few poll questions that have been, we've requested that they be broadcast. And if you guys could just take a quick moment to answer these questions. While you do that, I'll just give you a quick update on what Invest India is and what Invest India does. We are an investment promotion agency. We fall under DPIIT, Ministry of Commerce, and we're there to support any German companies in India, either to expand their footprint here or to enter the market. We support in terms of business advisory, market information, but also in terms of issue resolution and regulatory clearances that companies require to set up their operations in the country. Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for the answering the poll questions. It will help us in further customizing the support that we can give German investors. I now hand over the floor to Saurish.
Thank you, Jayant, for that very encouraging session. And I'm sure a lot of investors who are yet to decide will make up their minds and they will rush to make the investments in India. I will quickly just share my screen. Is the screen visible now?
Yes, Saurish.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is a topic which I have got a lot of questions from both the parents and subsidiaries of MNCs during the course of the last decade that I have been covering MNCs. So I'll dive straight into the topic, and in the slide you can see a summary of the key ways in which a parent can fund its Indian subsidiaries. Now these are two broad categories in which through which the foreign equity holder can finance its subsidiary, that is equity and debt. Within equity, there is equity shares or common stock, which we are all familiar with. And there are two other key ways, that is compulsory convertible debentures and compulsory convertible preference shares. These two routes are more or less very similar with slight differences between them, but we'll focus on compulsory convertible debentures on the equity side as an alternate to pure equity. On the debt, there are three main routes: the external commercial borrowing, bonds under foreign portfolio investor, and buyer's credit for imports. And there is another indirect way of funding, which is SBLC-backed funding, which we will also touch upon. To start with, we will see the broad transaction structure of compulsory convertible debentures and external commercial borrowing, just to get you started off. Hello.
Yes, Saurish, we can hear you.
So the CCD structure, the structures are are very simple for both the CCD and the ECB. In the CCD structure, the parent company infuses the subscribes to the debentures of the Indian subsidiary, that is the onshore subsidiary, which at maturity converts into equity. And during the life of the debentures, they are debt instruments, so the subsidiary pays interest or coupon to the parent. In the ECB, again, the foreign equity holder gives a direct loan to the onshore subsidiary, which is repaid during the tenure of the loan. and the Indian subsidiary continues to service the debt during its tenure through a interest payment. And this ECB can be in the form of INR or foreign currency. The next major category of debt financing is the bonds under FPI route. Now, this is a relatively new route which was opened up around 7-8 years back. So it's comparatively new when you compare it with an ECB route. So what is an FPI route? First of all, what is an FPI? An FPI is a foreign portfolio investor, which is an offshore entity which needs to be registered as such with our Securities and Exchange Board of India, that is SEBI. Now, this route envisages the FPI investing into INR debentures or bonds issued by a Indian issuer. In this case, the Indian issuer is the onshore subsidiary of the MNC parent, and the investor is one of the parent group companies, which is registered as an FPI with SEBI. Here, the instrument is in INR, the coupon payments are also made in INR, and the investor, since they are exposed to the currency risk, they can hedge the currency risk onshore with an Indian authorized dealer. Now, there are two main routes in which an FPI can make this investment. One is the general route, which, as the name suggests, is the normal or the usual route of investing. But in the general route, the main challenge for a MNC parent and child FPI transaction is that the general route does not allow a single FPI or a single group of related FPIs to invest more than 50% of a single issuance. For example, if an Indian subsidiary were to issue debentures worth, say, 20 million euro, a single group of related FPIs cannot invest more than 10 million euros, which defeats the purpose when the MNC parent is intending to finance the Indian subsidiary completely. So they came up with the voluntary retention route, or the VRR route, which has really taken off amongst MNCs, because VRR does not have any such cap. Provided the investor remains invested in the bonds for a minimum tenure of 3 years, and during those 3 years, it maintains, the FPI maintains a minimum investment of 75% in the total amount allocated to them initially. So VRR route is something through which a MNC parent-child FPI transaction can happen. The government has set limits for how much FPIs in aggregate can invest in Indian bonds, and as you can see, the VRR, under the VRR scheme, enough limits, 25% of the total limits allowed is available, which amounts to almost euro $2.5 billion. The last route of direct funding under the debt head is the buyer's credit for imports. Now, this is a instrument for borrowing which is quite common. It is also known as import loan, and a lot of companies use it when they avail buyer's credit from banks, when the bank extends a loan to the company but makes the payment to the supplier, to the offshore supplier. But not many are aware that the buyer's credit regulations allows even the parent to extend the buyer's credit. And why is it important to note this route is that this allows the parent to give short-term financing to the subsidiary. Unlike an ECB or an FPI bond, which is typically long-term, this allows the parent to give a short-term financing to the subsidiary as well. So now we have seen the direct funding routes. I think it's important to compare the 4 main routes, the first 3 being the debt route and the 4th one being an equity route. The debt route includes a parent ECB, import loan or buyer's credit, and bonds, and the equity is the INR CCD. This comparative table is self-explanatory, and you can go through it at your leisure, and if there are further questions, we can address them. But the key things, I'll just highlight a few key comparisons. One is the minimum average maturity. Minimum average maturity, as you can see, for an ECB, it is 3 years, but it can be 1 year for a manufacturing company. And if the ECB is given for a general corporate purpose or a working capital or for repayment of term loans, then the minimum tenor is 5 years. Now, these minimum tenors I'm talking about with respect to a parent ECB. If it's a third-party ECB, then some of the conditions change. In terms of, whereas the minimum tenor for a buyer's credit, there's no minimum tenor. There is a maximum of 12 months for raw material imports and a maximum of 3 years for capex imports. And bonds under FPI route, as we have seen, if it's a VRR route, then the minimum tenor is 3 years. This is an important distinction. End use wise, the buyer's credit route is available only when there is a physical import of materials. Otherwise, the parent ECB or the FPI route are flexible enough with the negative list only, which there is some end uses which are not allowed. For FPI bonds, if the bonds are listed, then even the negative list is further eliminated. That is, a listed bond can be used even for real estate activities as well. INR CCD being a equity instrument really is quite flexible. So as I said, you can you can go through the other key points of difference between the 4 instruments, but I'll just like to highlight the advantages and disadvantages of each route. Now, the first 3 are debt instruments. So the principal can be fully repatriated like all debt instruments. They provide a tax shield on the interest that they pay, because the interest is paid above the line, that is before the net profit, and hence the Indian subsidiaries get a tax shield on the interest paid. Coming specifically, typically these are from parents, so hence these are lower cost than loans from INR loans from external parties like banks. Coming specifically to ECB, ECB has the additional advantage that it can be denominated in INR or any of the freely convertible currencies. But the challenge with ECB is that there are some restrictions on tenor, pricing, end use, and administratively it is a little bit more difficult than say a buyer's credit, because there is a LRN that has to be obtained from RBI and monthly filings that need to be done with RBI. Buyer's credit, the main advantage, as I said before, is that this provides a mechanism for the parent to fund for working capital for shorter tenors. So it can be a 3-month buyer's credit or 6 months. So if there's a temporary cash flow issue and the parent wants to fund it, it can do it through buyer's credit route. And administratively, it is easier than ECB because there is no LRN, no RBI reporting monthly. The challenge being that it can only be used for actual physical import of materials. For bonds under FPI route, the main advantage is that it provides greater flexibility, especially when you're looking at a long-term funding, or when there is a MNC has multiple subsidiaries in India and it envisages funding multiple subsidiaries over a period of time. It can set up an FPI one time, and it uses that FPI to route the funding through various subsidiaries at various points of time going forward. So it's a one-time process to set up the FPI. And again, when we come to the challenges, that is one of the challenges one can say, because there is a process involved to register an FPI and there are administrative issues around it. The INR CCD is unique because CCD is part debt, part equity. So it has the advantage of equity because a lender treats this as equity, whereas for a parent debt, it has to be explicitly subordinated in order for a lender to treat it as equity. Being equity, a CCD, there's no end-use restrictions, completely free. You are free to do whatever you want with it. It is an INR instrument, no FX risk with a subsidiary. But unlike other equity instruments, the interest paid on the CCD provides a tax shield to the Indian subsidiary because it is above the line. Unlike the dividends on equity, which come below the line, and so the Indian subsidiary does not get a tax shield. And the main challenge of CCD is that it's an equity instrument, so principal cannot be repatriated freely. One common thing to keep in mind for all these parent financing options, the thin capitalization rules. I've provided a slide at the annexure for someone to refer to in more detail, but in essence, a thin capitalization rule is to disincentivize MNC from financing its subsidiaries disproportionately through debt rather than through equity. So basically, if there is interest paid beyond a certain amount is disallowed for tax benefit. So, and I think a lot of developed countries also have such rules, and you can go through it in detail in direction. And as I mentioned, if there are any questions, if anyone wants to explore any of these routes in more detail, we'll be happy to take you through that. And as Standard Chartered as a bank, we perform the role of an authorized dealer for any of these routes. And so wherever an authorized dealer is required for any such parent financing, we would be happy to help you. The last route, the indirect financing route, I would just like to touch upon it, which is the SBLC-backed funding. As I mentioned, where the offshore parent leverages its credit limits at the parent level, and the offshore lender issues an SBLC to an onshore lender, which sets up limits to the Indian subsidiary. So it's a very quick and easy way of setting up the limits. The subsidiary's cash and assets remain free, and the interest rates can be very competitive based on the rating of the SBLC issuing bank. I think with that, we complete the broad ways of funding, parent funding, and there are many nuances to it. There are many variations, and even in ECB, there is a lot of 4 different types of ECBs which are there in the annexure for you to refer. I will just leave you with a slide on Standard Chartered Bank, and just to summarize, we are the largest foreign bank in the country. Now with the closure of the retail division of our American competitor, we will be more than 4 times the next biggest foreign bank. We're the oldest foreign banks, and Standard Chartered India is amongst the top 4 markets for SCB globally. So that makes us very relevant to the banking in India as well. And we have a very good working relationship with RBI and other regulatory bodies, and we can help you navigate the regulatory compliance very easily and efficiently. Thank you. And on that note, and I'll be happy to address your queries, if any, in the Q&A session. I hereby invite Sneha to tell us about the new ways of hedging. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Is my presentation visible?
No, Sneha, can you accept the command? Show my screen that I've sent you.
Okay. Can you play it remotely from your end?
Yeah, sure. Sneha, can you see the presentation?
Yeah, indeed I can. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sneha Srivastava. I work with financial markets at Standard Chartered. I'm very happy to see you this afternoon. Thank you, Soresh, for that very detailed presentation on the various solutions that you put forth. Again, thank you very much, Jayant. A very, very interesting presentation, and certainly very, very cogent sell of to investors. What I'm trying to do through my presentation is basically take the 10-15 minutes to leave you with some insights on financial markets, with a view on what's happening globally, and also drill down to India, what we've been seeing, say in the dollar rupee currency, as well as what are the different changes that the Reserve Bank of India has come forth and basically liberalized since last year, making it easier for people to hedge their exposures, both onshore and offshore. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we live in interesting times, and in fact, I would say, interesting is really a euphemism, because it's strange times really. We've been living with this this virus for now over a year, and just when we thought that we're out of the woods, the mutants have arrived. And what we are seeing is basically the speed of the vaccine rollout across different countries is going to differ. The supply chain, of course, is stretched, and that is going to have the bearing on growth. So in 2020, there was a contraction of about 3.3% globally in growth because of the huge amount of lockdowns in economies. But we expect that as the economies start opening up, the growth is going to rebound to about 5.7%. Of course, I think this number will undergo a change if we see more waves coming through, because like India is already in the throes of second wave. God forbid more waves come in, we might see more lockdowns in other economies. So I think the caveat is going to be what is going to be the speed of the vaccine rollout, what are going to be the COVID variants. And of course, I think critically, what we have seen across economies is that the central banks have basically bought in a very, very soft interest rate regime and provided plenty of stimulus in terms of liquidity, availability of liquidity for people to be comfortable for investments. So because there is so much of pumping of liquidity by the different central banks, there is this incipient fear of inflation that it could be coming up. So we expect growth to kind of rebound globally, but the caveats remain, and that is something that we have to keep a lookout for. And next slide, please. So this is a very interesting slide. The left side of the slide actually shows how the emerging market economies are lagging the developed economies. Now, 32% of the population of the United States is already vaccinated. And if you look towards the bottom of this particular graph, you see that it's basically Africa and Oceania, which is the Australia and all the islands around it, really at the bottom, and right above that is Asia. So there is going to be a kind of a asynchronous spread of vaccines, and which is of course going to have a big bearing on how fast the global growth comes back. At the same time, on the right hand side of the slide, if I was to draw your attention, you'll see the multitude of waves. Like for example, if you see Brazil has unfortunately gone from wave to wave, and India is basically, if you can see the blue line, we had a kind of a shallow wave in August, September, then we were recovering, and of course a false sense of security, and then there we've zoomed up higher. So this is something that we have to be mindful of, that the COVID variants are around, but that's not all doom and gloom. Of course, we've got the vaccines around. Can we go to the next slide, please? So coming back to growth, how is growth going to come back? If you see, in 2020, it was China which was basically the supporter of growth, because they came back, stronger versus other economy, because obviously they started to fight the virus earlier and they had lockdowns. So the growth in China kind of supported the global growth. But 2021 is going to be the story of US, because of the vaccine rollout. We have seen, the unemployment numbers fall down. Job growth has been good. Investment is higher. And it is going to be the US that is going to pretty much be the bellwether of growth. Of course, India is also expected to grow 10% plus, but that's on the back of a low base. And if you look at the all other different countries, we are going to definitely see growth, coming back slowly and steadily as and when we see the vaccine rollouts progressing. And of course, the critical thing here is that the central banks as well as the governments continue with all the stimulus measures, and the inflation also kind of behaves, because the critical joker in the pack here is inflation. If inflation comes in a big way, then we definitely see interest rates moving up. There will be tremendous pressure on the central banks then to start hiking rates, at least little by little, and withdrawing the stimulus. Next slide, please. So we're coming to rupee. Rupee's been quite volatile. You can see basically, sometime in the end of March, beginning of April, people were pretty confident, that rupee was going to move into the trajectory of 70. There were a lot of flows coming in. There was, even the pace of buying from the Reserve Bank of India for the FX reserves had basically come down. And this is an important factor, because now we are at about $585 billion of FX reserves, but the central bank took a very studied choice to stop buying dollars from the spot market, and they started intervening in the forward market. Essentially, that means they started doing sell buy swaps. Now, why did they do this? This was sometime in the month of November. Why did they start doing this? Is because on one side they had open market operations where they were actually going and buying bonds and hence infusing liquidity. On the other side, they were also basically adding to their FX reserves, and hence, by buying spot, also again infusing liquidity. So because of that, there was like a double twin impact of liquidity in the system. Can you please go to the next slide? So coming back to why things turned around a little bit for the rupee in April 21. Basically, in the policy, RBI announced a 1 trillion balance sheet expansion via the GSEC support program. Basically, what they said is we'll go into the secondary market, and in the next 3 months, in the Q1, we are going to buy bonds worth 1 lakh crores. Now, when this news came out, basically market took it very negative. Essentially taking it as a kind of a monetization, of the debt, and because of that there was a huge spiral, and rupee actually flew all the way to 75.50. There was a huge amount of positioning where, because of the move earlier and RBI not being very aggressive, we had already seen a lot of people having sold, expecting rupee is going to basically go down to 71, 72. So there was a huge blowout in the positioning as well. At the same time, we also saw that the central bank said that we still need adequate FX reserves, so which basically meant that they are not going to stop buying. So all of that added up, and we saw a bit of a spiral in rupee. Now, SCB, the research team, basically has a forecast that dollar rupee will be 75 by the mid of 2021 and 76 half for the end of 2021, and mainly the risks, and these are of course important risks, is 40% of our imports is oil. It's crude. So oil has basically seen a runaway up move with the opening up of the economies, and oil prices is going to be very critical. When you have a lot of demand for the crude because of high prices, there is inevitably pressure on the rupee to depreciate. So this is going to be a critical factor. Of course, the current account balance, because the imports have started basically moving up, so that will be another factor putting pressure on the rupee. But at the same time, just wanted to give you a flavor in terms of what people are doing, because the Reserve Bank of India has been paying the swaps. Essentially, the premium for say booking a 1 year forward is very attractive. So if you were to say sell at 74, suppose currently in the market the rupee is at about 73.90, let's assume it's 74. If you go to sell spot at 74 and sell that for 1 year forward, you can get a kind of a 5% premium, which is very attractive, which is close to about 3.8 rupees. So that actually lands you at a 77.80 1 year hence. These are very attractive levels, not seen for a while. So what we have seen is a lot of the exporters have woken up and they have started hedging and basically receiving the premium. So attractive levels to hedge into. And I think upticks can definitely people would be looking to hedge. Can we move to the next slide, please? Again, very quickly, our research team did lower the growth forecast to 10.2% on the back of the second wave. Of course, we had a favorable base effect because the growth had been impacted in the last year. But the risk, again, for India, like for any other economy, will be the third wave if it comes quickly. And of course, our pace of vaccination, that is, of course, very, very critical. Inflation risks will exist, but I think as of now, and we've seen that from the governor's press conference yesterday, there is plenty of support, and we don't expect that the rates are going to be hiked in a jiffy. So that worry is not there. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is a poll. If you can see it on your screen, what is your expectation in terms of what dollar rupee will end at? This is just your view. Do you expect that it's going to be apocalyptic and rupee will go to 80? Do you think there will be recovery and we head back towards 70? So basically, what's your view? Thank you. Okay. A lot of people expect it to be at about 75 kind of levels. Understood. Basically roundabout here, but I think 1/3 of the participants are convinced that there is a good chance there would be a spiral, and we'll take out last year's high, which was I think 76.28, and head towards 80. Basically, when the world comes back online and travel starts, foreign travel will become very expensive. Let's go to the next slide, please. Again, as we've seen, the dollar rupee gyrating, the euro has also seen a lot of moves, and this is basically a chart of the euro rupee. If you see, again, the euro rupee had trended to below 86 end of March, beginning of April, and again because of the various announcements and position readjustment, it spiked to above 90 in April. So basically, just the next slide will again kind of try to do a dipstick in terms of what is the view in terms of where the euro is going to end up at. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a poll for you. Okay, I think it's kind of tied between 85 and 95. So let's assume it will be at 90 kind of levels, which is where we are. That kind of ties in with where the audience was actually thinking. A bit of the audience was thinking about dollar rupee. Can we go to the next slide, please? Again, these are our FX forecasts. Like I mentioned, 76.50 for the end of the year, and the euro rupee is 91.8. If you see the euro, basically forecasts, we see it, going stronger into 2022, because mainly we expect that recovery will be coming back, and some dollar weakness will be there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Hi, can we move to the next slide, please? So coming quickly to regulations. Now there has been a seminal shift in the regulations that govern the risk management and interbank dealings. These were released last year, and there has been an absolute sea change in terms of the method of basically looking at risk management. Basically, from the point of view of underlying, the Reserve Bank of India has made some changes. They have basically, they're now treating a current account exposure equally with a capital account exposure. Earlier, you could deal under a specific bill or invoice, which is called a contracted exposure, and you had a past performance whereby clients could take an average of the last 3 years of imports and exports and hedge under that. RBI has taken away the past performance that has kind of been subsumed into something called as an anticipated exposures, where basically a company can say that this is my anticipated exposure and I'm going to basically hedge this. Now, what is the catch? The catch is, you may say it's an anticipated exposure, but the expectation is that suppose if you booked a import, a forward for hedging an import, you will be utilizing the contract. Or in case you cancel the contract, then you still have to show the underlying. How is this, if I may say, different from past performance? Now, in past performance, up to 75% of your limit, you could easily rebook and cancel, no questions asked, profit would be passed. But under this anticipated exposures, what the Reserve Bank of India has given in terms of flexibility of not giving too much of paperwork and things like that, they have to put a little bit of a rationality and stop speculation, said that it's got to be utilized or at least show some kind of proof that there is an underlying to it. Now, coming to the summary of the key changes that you see on this particular slide. Now, anticipated exposures can be permitted to be hedged even for ECBs. So you basically, even before the LRN arrives, you can do that hedging. You can substitute underlying between contracted and anticipated exposures. Critically, now non-resident companies are allowed to approach the non-deliverable markets. Now through the GIFT City, basically we have this NDDC facility available. You have various Indian and foreign banks which have branches there, and they can actually make NDF prices to you. For a very long time, the Reserve Bank of India, like any other central bank, used to frown upon NDF, but that's a reality that can't be wished away with. So basically, I think they took a extremely positive move and a policy change that why don't we just quote NDF out of India itself. So this is a seminal move. Through the NDF, a non-resident investor or a company can easily hedge their exposures that they have to India, and they can when they actually choose to have funds coming into India or funds exiting from India, they can actually take the hedge onshore. So it's a huge amount of a very big regulatory change, if I may be putting it so. And because of this, there's a lot of depth that has come into the market. Quickly moving on to dividend hedging. Earlier, only once the dividend was declared, only then you could basically hedge it, and there were very limited models of being able to hedge it. But now MNC parents can easily hedge these transactions in the NDF. A lot of interest from German companies to look to hedge the dividend basically on the NDF, and then migrate the hedge to onshore India when the actual payment has to go out. So this is an interesting proposition for dividend hedging also. We can go to the next slide. So again, very quickly, basically with regards to ECB, you could only do swaps, forwards, and vanilla options. Now all kind of products are allowed. In fact, one very critical thing is that RBI has said that if you want to do any kind of derivative deal, which does not have rupee as a leg. So if suppose if you want to trade euro, you want to trade sterling, rupee is not a leg. You don't really need to give underlying for that. For dollar IRSs, again, rupee is not a involved currency. You don't need to give underlying for that. Things can be done on the anticipated route. So it is a sea change in terms of regulations. And of course, I think this will bring a huge amount of flows and a huge amount of flexibility in the ability of global corporates to hedge. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just coming back to the NDF hedging. In the NDF hedging, basically, clients can do a plethora of things. If you have a proposed infusion into India, or there is a parent loan coming into India, you can choose to go and hedge into NDF. You may not know the timelines, but of course you're running a currency risk. You can go and choose to hedge that on the NDF, and as and when the actual flow gets fructified, you can move it onshore. Of course, the critical thing being that only non-residents can execute NDFs. Indian companies and their onshore subsidiaries are not allowed to basically hedge via this market. What is needed for the NDF market is ISDA, a dealing mandate, and a legal entity identifier number. So it's basically, it's very easy. If you, in fact, if you do a hedge with the same bank in the gift city as well as onshore market. So basically, for example, StanChart has a branch in gift city through which it quotes NDF, and of course we are a branch based out of India also. If you do both the hedges with us, because the hedge will essentially be settled at the RBIB, it can be done very seamlessly and with very tight slippage. So it's a very good way to hedge your anticipated exposures coming into India, and this is something perhaps will be of great interest to people looking to invest in India. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a poll. Do you plan to undertake FX hedging for your Indian operations in 2021? Seek your views on that. Okay, we have a lot of people who are not planning to hedge, it seems. No. And we have some people planning to hedge and some people who are fence sitters maybe. Okay, okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a very critical question. Do you currently hedge your FX exposures on an online platform, or are you planning to basically, move your hedging to an online platform? Again, this is a poll. Okay, so about 16% hedge online. This is a very critical question, because what we have seen, and this was before COVID hit also, a lot of the clients have decided to move online to deal, because of course, besides the reason of work from home and the COVID issues, because you deal online, the entire value chain of FX risk management becomes very transparent. So from the point of view of having an exposure, submission of an underlying, booking of rates, having a confirmation generated, everything can be done online without any kind of exchange of emails, hard copies being exchanged, which of course is very difficult in the current scenario. And I'll just take you through that in the next minute. Can we just go to the annexures, please? The next slide after, yeah, the last slide. So very quickly, StanChart has a very bespoke platform created for India. This was created after looking at the various platforms that are there in India already, and we basically put a regulatory overview on top of it, and also studied the pain points. Created bespoke for India, it is a combined trade and FX platform, and basically what it offers is it's a one bank, one view. You don't need to talk to 10 different people in the bank to get your trade transactions done and your FX transactions done. Everything gets done online, seamlessly. The entire the entire life cycle of the transaction can be done online. And one very big advantage is that there is a plethora of analytics available. There's a huge amount of convenience of time stamping when you've dealt a particular trade. So all those advantages are very easily available, and we have seen clients across segments adopting the Flow Banker. So you can choose to move to an online platform, and you will see that there are great efficiencies that come to your way of dealing in the treasury. That's it from me. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Sana, I think, do you think we have time for questions since we've already overshot the
Maybe
time?
we can take 2-3 questions considering the time that we have in
Okay.
hand.
So I think I would invite Jed to start off. We can take one or two
Yeah,
questions.
okay. So one of the questions was on climate change and how is the government prioritizing clean energy. So I think that's a good question, and the answer is also very positive in the sense that renewable energy ranks very highly in the list of priorities and industries for Government of India. Already we have one of the most not one of the most, the most ambitious renewable energy plans globally. Currently, our renewable energy capacity is 94 gigawatts, which we plan to increase to 175 gigawatts by 2022, end of 2022, and to 450 gigawatts by 2030. And the base is already very strong. We're the 5th largest installed capacity for renewable energy, and 4th largest for wind, 5th largest again for solar energy. If you're looking at some of the things that the government has done, 1.3 billion has already been allocated for 50 solar parks, which will generate more than 40 gigawatts of extra renewable energy by the end of the year. Then again, as I was mentioning, the production-linked incentive scheme is another very important initiative to promote renewable energy. And under this initiative, 4,500 crores has been introduced for high efficiency solar PVs. So there's a lot going on in the renewable energy space. There is a tremendous amount of interest in renewables from in the India-Europe investment corridor as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jed. So I'll take one question. It's a very short one. Could you share the guidelines for short-term buyer's credit by parent company? Does it fall under RBI TC, that is Trade Credit Framework? Yes, it does fall under the Trade Credit Framework of RBI, and I can share the guidelines in more detail. If the participant can send me an email, my email was there in the presentation, and I can share the presentation through IGCC. If you can write to me, I can share with you the detailed guidelines regarding that. I think there was one question for Sneha. I don't know, Sneha, if you were able to catch that.
Hi, I can see 2 questions. I can see 2 questions. Question is, fair to expect Euro rupee trends to follow your dollar rupee forecasts? Well, we hope so. But basically, a great thing, an important factor will be how does the euro also behave. We are expecting a recovery to go forth, that euro will end at 120 in 2021, 122 in 2002, on the back of growth coming back, and stimulus kind of in a very balanced way being withdrawn. So that is one factor on the Eurozone. The second thing on dollar rupee, of course, if we were to see some kind of a, a lot of 1/3 of the participants basically put that they expect rupee to go to 80. Now, if it goes to 80, then your guess is as good as mine. I think forecasts will not hold good, and that will be a new normal. And perhaps then we'll be, looking at higher levels in the euro rupee versus what we, saw on the slide. Of course, basically even last year for that matter, when we saw rupee go to 76.28, it was more like a tail event, right? It was more because the markets had gone into a kind of a tailspin. And if you currently look at how risk is being perceived, whether you have equities, whether you have bonds, whether you have commodities, whether you have real estate, everything's for the taking. There is so much of liquidity that the liquidity has to chase yield somewhere, right? So that yield chasing is continuing, and we are not seeing any kind of sell-off that is happening, which might potentially pressurize the dollar rupee. So yes, there is forecast, and there is of course always this chance that you could see some bit of consolidation or some risk of coming back into the system, when you might see euro rupee going into a slide. That is very much possible. And quickly going into the second question on the NDDC and NDF being the same. Indeed, it's the same. NDDC, as RBI defines, is the non-deliverable derivative contracts. That's the Indian nomenclature. It is essentially the same as NDF.
Thanks, Neha. I think Sana.
Yes. Yeah. So ladies, yes. So ladies and gentlemen, the other questions that you had put up and we were not able to take it up live, we assure you that your questions will be shared with the speakers and they will get back to you over email. Honey, may you go ahead with the vote of thanks? Okay. Okay. So having said that, I'll proceed with the vote of thanks. On behalf of the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce, we would like to thank our knowledge partner for this session, the Standard Chartered Bank and Invest India. A sincere thanks to our panelists, Mr. Jayant Singh, Mr. Saurish Mitra, and Ms. Neha Srivastava, for coming on board and rendering us with a comprehensive and informative session relevant to investment in business activities across all sections post-COVID. Thank you very much. We extend a big thank you to all our esteemed guests for your active participation and listening so very patiently. A recorded link of today's session will be sent to you all. Please do write to us sharing your valuable feedback. In addition, I wish to express my gratitude to our IGCC team, Hani, Munaz, Nikhil, and Samia, for having successfully put this webinar together. As for our dear audience, please do visit our website to know more about the upcoming webinars, and we hope to have your presence and participation for our future events with the same zest as well. Thank you until next time. Keep well and stay safe. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you.
Thank you.